Welcome to Mr. Giant Reacts and Ting and Ting and Ting. I'm Mr. Giant, and someone had pointed out to me that I did not watch this final episode of this series here. Excuse me. It's Europe, the First Crusade, On to Jerusalem by Extra Credit. So we gonna watch it to Ting, you understand? Let's YouTube and simmer.
Last we left off, the Crusaders had just taken Antioch. Now they have to hold it. There's just a small series of problems. One, the Turkish army bearing down on them has now surrounded Antioch. Two, the Turkish garrison in Antioch still holds the citadel, which is inside the city walls. Three, Antioch is almost out of food after that prolonged siege the Crusaders themselves put it under. Four, the day before they took Antioch, Stephen of Blois just decided that everything was hopeless and abandoned the crusade, for which he would be mocked for the rest of his days. 5. To compound his desertion, on his way back, Stephen ran into the Byzantine relief army and told them all hope was lost. So the Byzantines were like, okay, and promptly turned around to defend their own territory. So there would be no Byzantine reinforcements arriving. But for 4 straight days, the Turks assaulted the walls, and for 4 days, the beleaguered Crusaders held. Bohemond desperately racing between containing the Turks in the citadel and trying to hold the wall. Godfrey rallying the troops. The Turks attacked in waves to keep their forces fresh, but there were already too few Crusaders to hold the great ramparts, and so they fought without relief. After 4 days of vicious combat, the Turks decided, you know what, let's just starve these guys out. So, once again, starvation set in, and Crusader morale began to drop. Things looked bleak, but then, a sign. An impoverished local mystic claimed to have had a vision of St. Andrew telling him where the Lance of Longinus, the holy lance that supposedly pierced Christ's side, was buried. So the Crusaders started to dig a big hole in the floor of the Church of St. Peter in Antioch. The mystic jumped down into the pit, and lo and behold, he pulled out a hunk of iron. "We found it," he said, "the head of the Lance of Longinus." Bohemond and Tancred were skeptical, and Bishop Adhemar was having none of it. They already had one of those Holy Lance things back in Rome, but the ordinary soldiers were inspired. Raymond declared it a sign that they would prevail. 13 days later, with food running out, the gaunt and wild-eyed Crusaders rode out of the gates to attack the Turks. Carrying the Lance of Longinus and with the fervor of men otherwise doomed, the Crusaders let out a great yell and charged the vastly
Oh, isn't that that's crazy? It's not funny per se, but it's crazy because anybody at any time during a battle could come up with something like that to rally the troops. Would that work in modern times? Let me know in the comment section. I mean, would that really work in modern times? Unless it's a holy war and there's something missing that they would think it's relevant to their beliefs. Because it seems that these days modern wars are fought on the premise of patriotism and freedom and like religious freedom and stuff like that. There's never like a real symbol, unless you might say the flag, but I don't think that flag would have such a massive effect on people's minds as would a religious artifact or something like that. Now that might work here in America because people love the flags here. Don't step on it, don't do this with it, don't do that with it. So that might work here, but other than that, I remember an order that says fight till the last man die, and every last man put his weapon down and went home. Let's get back to this video.
superior Turkish force. 6 columns of men, each led by one of the lords of the crusade, poured out of the city gates and slammed into the Turkish line. Later, soldiers would speak of having seen the saints riding amongst them, carrying banners of white, riding steeds like snow. And with desperation they fought. The Turks lit a great fire to drive them back, but through flame and smoke they fought on, until at last, against all odds, the Turkish line collapsed. The Crusaders fell upon the Turkish camp and the stores held there. The crusade had survived. Unbeknownst to the Crusaders, though, they'd had one advantage. While the Turkish host appeared to them to be one mighty army, it was actually, like the crusading force, made up of many smaller armies with their own commanders. And it turns out that many of those commanders would have rather seen the Crusaders keep Antioch than have it fall into the hands of their superior. So as soon as the battle began to turn, many of them used it as an excuse to just desert and flee. But no matter the cause, the Crusaders had overcome the last great obstacle between them and Jerusalem. Now the crusade would be complete in no time, right? Not exactly. Raymond and Bohemond immediately began to dispute who would get to keep Antioch. Bohemond, always a little slyer than Raymond, eventually won out, after months and months of arguing while the crusade languished in Antioch. During that time, Hugh was sent off to talk to the Byzantine Empire about rejoining the crusade, but Hugh was never Alexius's favorite, and his pleas seemed to have little impact. So what did Hugh do? Instead of returning to the crusade, as originally planned, he basically said, "Well, I'm out. Peace," and wandered off back to Europe, for which he would be mocked for the rest of his days.
What's
And that's
going
not all.
on here?
During the months spent sitting around Antioch, a sickness passed through the camp, and Bishop Adhemar took ill and died, leaving the crusade as a whole functionally leaderless. At this point, Raymond, deciding that he possessed the Holy Lance and thus should be leader, started the crusade south again. This decision was in some ways precipitated by one of the grimmest moments in the crusade, the siege of the nearby city of Marat. After massacring the local population, while Bohemond and Raymond disputed who owned the place, the Crusaders were reduced to such a state of hunger that even the Western chroniclers talk in appalled tones about them roasting and boiling the dead Turks to eat. So, with only one major incident of cannibalism behind him, Raymond came to the conclusion that he had been ordained by God to lead the Crusade south toward Jerusalem, and started trekking through the country. But only Tancred and Robert of Normandy agreed to follow. Jerusalem was in Shia hands at this point in time, so the crusade actually passed through most of the countryside without incident. The local Sunni population even helped supply them in the hopes that the Crusaders would both leave them alone and give the Shia a good kicking. But then Raymond decided that he needed to attack the town of Arca, which is pretty random as it had no bearing on them getting to Jerusalem. Of course, it would have some bearing if you were secretly planning to subvert the crusade in order to take over Tripoli and set up a kingdom of your own there, but we'll never know if that was Raymond's true intention because he utterly failed. In fact, he failed so spectacularly that Tancred and Robert left him to go join Godfrey, whom Raymond promptly asked for help. The combined Robert, Tancred, Godfrey army showed up, but it still wasn't enough to prosecute the siege, so the crusade just kinda stalled out again. Until a clergyman in Godfrey's army basically challenged the mystic who had found the Holy Lance to a monk duel, and the mystic agreed to undergo an ordeal by fire. Tragically, said mystic was not protected by God during the ordeal, and burned to death, and the lance was discredited. Most of Raymond's credibility had come from possessing that lance, and now, since the lance was no longer a sacred object, thanks to the clergy beatdown, Godfrey took over and said, "Let's get back to going south toward Jerusalem, huh?" So, without further incident, other than one moment where Tancred popped over to conquer Bethlehem just real quick, the Crusaders finally made it to Jerusalem. But by this point, the crusade was in tatters. Baldwin was up in Edessa doing his own thing. Hugh had abandoned the crusade. Bohemond was holding down Antioch. The Byzantines were just done with the whole affair. Stephen had run off, and Adhemar was dead. There weren't really a lot of crusaders left to do the besieging. To add to this, the Fatimid forces holding the city had poisoned all the nearby wells, so the crusaders were also rapidly succumbing to thirst. The remaining princes decided they'd have to take Jerusalem by assault or not at all. There's no way they could maintain a siege. But there was still one other problem. The surrounding countryside had been stripped bare. There was no lumber to build siege towers or scaling ladders. Things looked pretty hopeless. But just then, a group of Genoese ships arrived at a nearby port and saved the day. The Genoese agreed to dismantle their ships and bring the timber as quickly as possible to Jerusalem. The crusade wasn't over yet. The siege towers began to rise. On July 13th, 1099 CE, the assault on Jerusalem began. The Crusaders split into two forces, one led by Raymond, the other on the opposite side of the city led by Godfrey and Tancred. As Raymond's tower began to roll forward, it was battered and nearly destroyed. Raymond's assault had failed, but Godfrey and Tancred had been far more crafty. Like Raymond, they too had been erecting a siege tower on their side, and seeing this, the defenders had prepared their defenses all along the wall facing it. But unlike Raymond, the night before the assault, Godfrey and Tancred had disassembled and rebuilt their siege equipment in front of a totally different part of the wall. When the assault began, the section of the wall they attacked was completely unprepared. Still, the fighting swayed back and forth. For 2 days, the Crusaders assaulted the walls, and for 2 days they were held back. Raymond's tower was burnt to the ground, and many...
Man, just fighting for 2 days straight. No, the dead is one thing, but my goodness, surviving all of that's got to be a different story there. Got to be, got to be disastrous on someone's psyche.
Many of the siege engines were smashed, but at last Godfrey's tower reached the wall. Godfrey and Tancred were among the first to cross. The battle along the wall was hard fought. No grand strategy or clever maneuvers, just a desperate melee that resolved down to a few hundred instances of men locked in single combat. But in the end, the Crusaders won out and opened the city gates. Now, with forces pouring in from all sides, the Muslim defenders broke and fled into the city. Victorious, the Crusader army began the biggest massacre the Holy Land had ever seen. Men, women, and children were slain as they ran through the streets. The chroniclers describe Crusaders wading ankle-deep in blood through Jerusalem as they butchered all those they could find. Only the youngest of the crusading princes, Tancred, tried to stop the slaughter, going so far as to give a group of Muslims his banner and telling them to show it to anybody who came for them to let them know that they were under his protection. But even this was futile. Tancred was called off to attend to some other part of the fighting, and when he returned, those he'd offered protection to were dead upon the mosque floor. There would be one more battle outside of Jerusalem, but this was pretty much it. That's how the Crusaders retook the Holy Land. And thus, the First Crusade ended.
Wow. Total massacre and thing, you know? It's craziness. Anyway, man, y'all, I'll leave a link in the description for this video. Thank you so much for watching this with me, and whoever reminded me, thank you for reminding me to watch this very last one of the Crusade. Hope you guys are having a good day. I'll leave links here so that you guys can keep watching some of the stuff. You could go in and watch this whole series that I watched and stuff like that. Y'all take care of each other, alright? Cool runnings.